The world tells you that a lone woman in the Dakota territories is either a fool or a ghost. That survival means a high fence and a low profile. But what happens when the very danger you've built your life to avoid washes up at your feet, bleeding in the current of the river that gives you life? For Isabel Moreau, the choice was simple. Let the Lakota warrior die and pray his ghost didn't haunt her or pull him from the water and face the living. She chose the living, and in doing so, she invited a storm of vengeance to her door, a storm that would arrive with the rising sun. The sun over the Dakota territory was a merciless, molten coin, scorching the sparse grasses of the valley and baking the mud along the banks of Whispering Creek. For Isabel Moreau, it was just another day measured in chores, each one a small victory against the encroaching wilderness that had swallowed her husband whole 2 winters past. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her small homestead, a sturdy log cabin her Jean-Pierre had built, a vegetable patch stubbornly yielding to her care, and the ever-present watchful silhouette of the Black Hills. Her son, 6-year-old Samuel, was her sun and moon. His laughter light and untroubled as he chased grasshoppers near the cottonwoods was the only sound that could truly silence the oppressive quiet of their isolation. She watched him from the creek bank, her hands raw from scrubbing laundry on a washboard. The lye soap stung the cracks in her skin, a familiar pain that kept her grounded. It was Samuel who saw it first. "Mama, look," he called, his voice a sharp note in the afternoon haze. He pointed a grubby finger downstream. "The log is swimming." Isabel squinted, shading her eyes. A dark shape, snagged momentarily on a submerged rock, bobbed in the gentle current. It wasn't a log. It was too fluid, too human. Her heart seized, a cold fist clenching in her chest. Travelers were rare in this secluded valley, and rarely did they arrive by river. Every stranger was a potential threat, a disruption to the fragile peace she had fought tooth and nail to maintain. "Samuel, get back to the cabin. Now," she ordered, her voice low and tight. He knew that tone. It was the one she used when a coyote got too bold or a storm was brewing. Without argument, he scampered up the bank and toward the safety of the log walls. Her hand went instinctively to the small skinning knife she kept at her belt. It was a poor defense, but it was something. She waded cautiously into the cool water, the hem of her calico dress instantly soaked and heavy. The creek, usually a source of life and solace, felt menacing. As she drew closer, the details sharpened into a nightmare. It was a man face down in the water. His buckskin leggings were dark with wetness and something more. A cascade of long black hair fanned out around his head like a dark halo. He was Lakota. The intricate beadwork on his moccasins, one of which was barely clinging to his foot, told her that much. Panic flared in her throat, hot and acidic. The Lakota kept to the hills their sacred Paha Sapa. Their presence this deep in the valley and in this state meant trouble of a kind she couldn't handle. Her first instinct was to retreat. Leave him to the river. To get involved was to invite chaos she could not afford. The stories from Redemption Gap, the nearest settlement she assiduously avoided, were filled with blood and terror tales of raids and scalpings that made decent folk shudder. But as the current nudged him, his head turned slightly. For a fleeting second, his face broke the surface. His eyes were closed, his features drawn in pain, but he was young. Younger than she had expected, and beneath the grime and the blood matting his hair, there was a nobility to his features that stopped her cold. He was somebody's son, somebody's brother. He was a man drowning in inches of water. The memory of finding Jean-Pierre, his body broken at the bottom of a ravine after a fall, flashed through her mind. The helplessness, the finality. She couldn't walk away. Cursing her own conscience, she plunged forward, the water swirling around her waist. She gripped his arm. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. With a strength born of desperation, she hauled him toward the bank, his body leaving a faint, pinkish trail in the water. She dragged him onto the grassy verge, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He lay still, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic movements. He was alive. The realization brought no relief, only a fresh wave of fear. She saw the wound, then a ragged, puckered hole high on his side, just below the ribs. It was a bullet wound, angry and inflamed. An older wound by the looks of it, festered and poorly tended. He must have been running hiding for days. Delirium and blood loss had finally driven him into the creek. And then came the thought, cold and certain, as a winter frost, he wouldn't be alone. A warrior like this in his prime would belong to a war band or a hunting party. They would be looking for him. They would follow his trail, a trail that now ended at her cabin. They would see the drag marks from the river. They would find him here with her, a white woman. They would not ask questions. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and blood. They would come at dawn. The certainty of it settled in her bones. She had until sunrise to make an impossible decision. Dragging him back to the river was murder. Keeping him here was suicide, not just for her, but for Samuel. She looked at the warrior's face. A line of blue paint, faded by the water, was drawn across his cheekbones, a symbol of his clan, his identity. He was not a monster from a campfire story. He was a human being dying at her feet. "Lord, what have I done?" she whispered to the empty sky. But she knew. She had made a choice the moment she waded into the water. She couldn't unmake it now. With a final desperate look toward the silent, watching hills, she hooked her arms under his and began the Herculean task of dragging the unconscious Lakota warrior toward her home, each step sealing her fate. The war band would come at dawn, and she would be here to meet them. The floorboards of the cabin groaned under the warrior's weight. Getting him inside had been a draining ordeal that left Isabel shaking and slick with sweat. She had laid him on a spare pallet near the hearth, the only place she could think of. The air in the small cabin, usually filled with the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke, now held the metallic tang of blood and the damp, earthy smell of the river. Samuel watched from the corner, his small face a mask of fear and fascination. He clutched a crudely carved wooden horse, his knuckles white. "Is he a bad man, Mama?" he whispered. Isabel paused, her hand hovering over the warrior's feverish brow. "He's a hurt man, Samuel. That's all we know right now." She gave her son a reassuring look she was far from feeling. "I need you to be a brave boy for me." "Can you do that? Keep the fire fed, just small pieces to keep the water warm." The boy nodded, his eyes wide but determined. He understood his role in their small, two-person world. He was a helper, a partner in their survival. Her attention returned to the man on the floor. In the flickering firelight, she could see him more clearly. His skin was the color of rich copper, stretched taut over a frame that was lean but powerful. A leather thong around his neck held a single eagle feather and a bear claw talismans of his life and spirit. Even in his unconscious state, he possessed an aura of coiled strength that was both intimidating and deeply compelling. She knew little of medicine beyond the folk remedies her grandmother had taught her. Poultices for drawing out infection teas, for fever, stitches for gashes. A bullet wound was another matter entirely. Probing for the lead was beyond her skill. She would likely do more harm than good. All she could do was clean the wound and pray. She cut away the blood-stiffened buckskin shirt with her skinning knife. The flesh around the entry point was swollen and discolored a violent purple and red. He moaned a low, guttural sound, and his body twitched. His eyes fluttered open. For a moment they were unfocused, clouded with pain and fever. Then they found her, and the haze vanished, replaced by a sharp, feral intensity. They were dark eyes, intelligent and filled with a raw, untamed spirit. He tried to raise his hand instinctively, reaching for a knife that was no longer at his belt. "Easy," Isabel said softly, holding up her empty hands. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe." The words were meaningless to him. He spoke his voice a dry rasp, a string of harsh, unfamiliar syllables. It was a command or a question she couldn't tell. All she understood was the hostility in it. He saw not a savior, but an enemy. A white woman. She shook her head slowly. "I don't understand." She pointed to the wound, then to the basin of warm water she'd prepared. "Let me help." He stared at her, his jaw tight suspicion warring with the exhaustion that was clearly pulling him back under. He was a cornered wolf, too weak to fight, but too proud to surrender. Isabel knew this was the critical moment. If he fought her, his wound would worsen, and she couldn't force him. Samuel, seeing the tense standoff, took a hesitant step forward. He held out his wooden horse. "Horse," he said, his small voice clear in the quiet cabin. The warrior's gaze flickered to the boy, and for an instant, the hard glare softened. He saw not a threat, but a child. His eyes then moved back to Isabel, reassessing her. He saw the worn dress, the calloused hands, the worry etched around her eyes. He saw a mother in her home, not a soldier on a battlefield. Slowly, painfully, he relaxed his head, falling back onto the pallet. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was permission. Working quickly before he could change his mind, Isabel cleansed the wound as gently as she could with boiled water and clean rags. He bore the pain with stoic silence, his only reaction a tightening of the muscles in his arms and a thin sheen of sweat on his brow. She then crushed yarrow and plantain leaves, herbs known for their ability to draw out poison and stem bleeding, and mixed them into a thick poultice. As she applied the green paste, her fingers brushed against his skin. It was hot, a dry, dangerous heat that spoke of a deep infection. She covered the poultice with a clean strip of linen, torn from one of Jean-Pierre's old shirts. As she worked, she found a small leather pouch tied to his belt. It was still dry. Her hands hesitated. It was an invasion of his privacy, but she needed to know who he was, what she was dealing with. Justifying it as a necessity, she opened it. Inside was not a weapon or a map. There was a lock of a woman's hair tied with a blue bead, and a small, smooth stone painted with the symbol of a soaring eagle. It was a medicine pouch, a collection of sacred personal items. This was a man with a family, with beliefs, with a life that extended far beyond this violent moment. He was Wombly the eagle. The stone told her so. She quickly closed the pouch, a feeling of shame mixing with her fear. Tending his wound felt like an act of humanity. Prying into his life felt like a violation. Throughout the night, she sat vigil, periodically spooning broth and fever, reducing willow bark tea between his cracked lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring in his own tongue, his dreams filled with ghosts she couldn't see. Samuel eventually fell asleep on his cot, the wooden horse held tight against his chest. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the man's labored breathing. Isabel sat in her rocking chair, her husband's heavy Winchester rifle resting across her lap. It felt alien and heavy, a tool of death in her hands. But she knew its purpose. She was under no illusions. The truce she had forged with the warrior was as fragile as a spider's web, liable to be broken by a single misunderstood gesture, and it meant nothing to the men who were coming for him. When they arrived, they would not see the woman who had shown mercy. They would see her as a captor, a defiler, a collaborator with their enemy. She stared into the dying embers of the fire, her mind racing. She could try to explain, but how? How could she bridge the chasm of language culture and a century of bloodshed with a few gestures and a clean bandage? The night deepened. The moon cast long, eerie shadows through the single cabin window. Every rustle of leaves, every hoot of an owl sounded like the approach of moccasined feet. She was a prisoner in her own home, trapped by an act of compassion. Dawn was coming, and with it a reckoning. The pale grey light of pre-dawn had just begun to seep through the cabin's window when the sound came. It wasn't the sound Isabel had been dreading, the soft tread of many feet or the nicker of Indian ponies. It was the heavy rhythmic thud of shod horses and the jingle of spurs. A cold dread different, but no less potent, trickled down her spine. She peered through a crack in the shutters. 2 riders were approaching, their forms dark against the growing light. As they drew closer, she recognized them. Silas Blackwood and his foreman, Jedediah. Blackwood was a cattleman who had been methodically buying up all the land in the territory, by coin or by coercion. He was a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He'd made no secret of his desire for Isabel's homestead. Its reliable access to Whispering Creek made it a prime piece of real estate in his burgeoning empire. Since Jean-Pierre's death, his visits had become more frequent, his offers less polite. Jedediah was his shadow, a hulking, silent man with a cruel set to his mouth and a new model repeating rifle he was never without. He was Blackwood's fist, the unspoken threat behind his master's silken words. Panic seized Isabel. The warrior Wombley was still weak, drifting in a feverish sleep on the pallet. They couldn't see him. If Blackwood found a wounded Lakota in her cabin, he would have the perfect excuse to run her off her land, painting her as an Indian sympathizer, a traitor to her own kind. He could have the marshal from Redemption Gap out here before noon. "Samuel," she whispered urgently, shaking her son awake. "Samuel, wake up. I need you to be very, very quiet. Go to the loft and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" The boy, still groggy with sleep, nodded and scrambled up the ladder to the small sleeping loft, pulling an old quilt over himself. Isabel's mind raced. She threw a heavy buffalo hide over the sleeping warrior, obscuring his form. It was a clumsy concealment, but it was the best she could do. She then splashed her face with cold water from the basin, trying to erase the sleepless night from her features, and took a deep, steadying breath. Taking her husband's Winchester, she leaned it against the wall by the door, a casual statement that she was not defenseless. Then, schooling her face into a mask of weary neutrality, she opened the door. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. "Jedediah, an early start for you gentlemen." Blackwood dismounted his expensive leather boots, sinking slightly into the soft earth. He swept off his hat, revealing slick, dark hair. "Mrs. Moreau, forgive the intrusion. Jedediah and I were tracking some stray cattle. Saw your lamp was lit and thought we'd check in. A woman alone, you can't be too careful. There's talk of Lakota on the move." He let his eyes drift past her, trying to peer into the dim interior of the cabin. "Everything all right? You look tired." "Raising a boy and running a homestead is tiring work," Isabel replied smoothly, not moving from the doorway. "We're fine, haven't seen any strays." Jedediah remained on his horse, his gaze flat and unnerving. His eyes roamed over the cabin, the creek, the woods like a predator surveying its territory. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her porch steps. "Heard some commotion down by the creek late yesterday," he grunted. Isabel's heart hammered against her ribs. Had they seen something? That was just Samuel playing. His imagination can get the better of him. Blackwood smiled, a predatory curl of the lips. Of course. The boy needs a father figure. This is no life for a child, Isabel. Or for a lady like yourself. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "My offer still stands. $500. More than fair for this small plot. You could have a nice house in Redemption Gap, a comfortable life. This plot is my home, Mr. Blackwood. It's all I have of my husband. It's not for sale." Her voice was firm, the finality in her tone unmistakable. Blackwood's smile faltered. His eyes hardened. Pride is a cold comfort on a winter's night, Mrs. Moreau. And this land, it has a way of swallowing up people who are too proud to see what's best for them. It was a clear threat. As he spoke, his gaze fixed on something inside the cabin over her shoulder. He was looking at the buffalo hide on the floor. A slight frown creased his forehead. "Redecorating. The floor gets drafty," she said quickly. From beneath the hide came a low moan. The sound was soft, barely audible, but in the tense silence it was like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Jedediah's hand moved instinctively closer to the rifle in its scabbard. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, all pretense of civility gone. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "The cabin settling." Isabel lied, her mind screaming. The old logs groaned sometimes. Blackwood wasn't buying it. He took a step toward the door, his intent clear. Isabel stood her ground, her body blocking the entrance. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would push her aside. The air crackled with unspoken violence. She stared him down, channeling every ounce of defiance she possessed. She thought of Jean-Pierre, of the promise she'd made to never let this land go. She thought of Samuel hiding in the loft. She would not break. Finally, after a long, tense standoff, Blackwood let out a short, humorless laugh. He backed away, but the look in his eyes promised this wasn't over. "Have it your way, widow." He sneered, the term widow, now an insult. "But don't come crying to me when your stubbornness gets you and that boy killed. The Lakota don't take kindly to squatters on their sacred land." He mounted his horse, his movements stiff with anger. "Jedediah," he barked. "Let's go. We're wasting our time." Jedediah gave Isabel one last, lingering look before turning his horse to follow. As he did, the rising sun caught the barrel of his rifle. Isabel noticed a fresh, deep scratch in the walnut stock, a distinctive mark near the trigger guard. She watched them ride away until they were small figures disappearing over the rise. Only then did she allow herself to sag against the doorframe, her legs trembling. She had survived the first test, but Blackwood's visit had changed everything. It was no longer just about the Lakota. She was now caught between two circling vultures, and she knew with a chilling certainty that one of them was bound to strike. The warband was still coming, but the enemy she knew by name had just declared his own war. The moment Blackwood and Jedediah were out of sight, Isabel slammed the heavy wooden bar across the cabin door and rushed to the pallet. The warrior Wombly had pushed aside the heavy hide, his eyes open and alert, though still clouded with fever. He had heard everything. The hostile tone of the white men's voices needed no translation. He struggled to sit up, hissing in pain as the movement pulled at his wound. He spoke in his tongue the words urgent questioning. He pointed toward the door, then at Isabel. "They're gone." she assured him, though her own heart was still pounding. "They're gone for now." Samuel scrambled down from the loft, his eyes wide. "Are they coming back, Mama?" "I don't know, sweetheart." She hugged him tightly. "I don't know." Isabel turned her attention back to Wombly. The confrontation had agitated him, and his breathing was more labored. She needed to get his fever down. She offered him more willow bark tea, and this time he drank it without hesitation, his eyes never leaving her face. The fragile truce, born of necessity, was solidifying. They had a shared enemy. Later that morning, as she was changing his dressing, he surprised her. He touched her arm gently to get her attention. Then, using his good hand, he began to communicate. It was a slow, painstaking process, a language of signs and gestures. He pointed to himself. "Wombly!" He said, his voice stronger than before. He then pointed to the painted eagle on his medicine pouch. "Eagle." He then pointed to her. "Isabel," she said. She then pointed to her son. "Samuel." Wombly nodded, repeating the names softly, committing them to memory. It was the first bridge across the chasm between their worlds. Then his expression grew dark. He began to tell her what had happened. He mimed, scouting his fingers, moving like silent feet. He gestured to the east, indicating his people were a day's ride away. He had been alone observing. Then he made the shape of a rifle with his hands and mimicked its loud report. He clutched his side, recreating the moment he was shot. Isabel assumed he had been ambushed by a rival tribe, perhaps the Crow or Pawnee, but Wombly shook his head vehemently. He held up 2 fingers, indicating 2 riders. He then made a gesture she didn't understand, rubbing his thumb and forefingers together. "Money." Then he pointed to the land outside the cabin, making a sweeping gesture. He was trying to tell her they were white men. And they weren't soldiers. They were men interested in the land in payment. The pieces began to click into place with terrifying clarity. Wombly wasn't finished. He mimed the man who shot him, a big man. He lifted an imaginary rifle to his shoulder. Then, with startling accuracy, he used a piece of charcoal from the hearth to draw on a spare piece of wood. He drew the rifle. He couldn't capture every detail, but he drew one feature with deliberate care, a deep, ugly scratch on the stock. The image seared itself into Isabel's mind. The scratch on Jedediah's rifle. The air left her lungs in a rush. It wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't soldiers or rival tribes. It was Blackwood's man. Wombly must have seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Perhaps Blackwood making a deal with someone, or surveying the land far beyond his own claim. Wombly was a witness. They hadn't just wounded him. They had tried to murder him and leave his body for the wolves. Blackwood's visit wasn't a coincidence. He wasn't just tracking stray cattle. He was tracking a wounded man. He hadn't come to intimidate her into selling. He had come looking for the warrior he thought must be dead or dying nearby. The commotion Jedediah heard by the creek yesterday wasn't Samuel playing. It was her dragging Wombly from the water. She was no longer just hiding a wounded Lakota from his people. She was harboring the sole witness to an attempted murder committed by the most powerful, ruthless man in the valley, a man who wanted her dead and her land gone. The complexity of her situation was staggering. If the Lakota arrived, they might kill her before she could explain. If she turned Wombly over to Blackwood, she would be signing the man's death warrant and would still have Blackwood as an enemy. There was no one to turn to. The law in Redemption Gap was in Blackwood's pocket. She looked at Wombly, who was watching her, his dark eyes searching her face, seeing the dawning horror and understanding there. He had entrusted her with his life, and in doing so had unwittingly placed her in the crosshairs of his attacker. He reached out and touched the Winchester rifle that was once again leaning against the wall near her. He looked at it then at her, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a threat. It was an acknowledgement. He understood her position, and he was indicating that the rifle, her only real source of power, was now a tool for their shared survival. He was no longer her patient or her prisoner. He was her ally. The fear that had been her constant companion for the last day didn't vanish, but it changed. It crystallized into a hard, cold resolve. Blackwood had mistaken her for a helpless sheep. He had underestimated her grief, her love for her son, and her connection to this land that held her husband's bones. He thought she was a victim. He was about to find out she was a survivor. She picked up the rifle, the weight of the steel and wood, familiar and reassuring. She checked the chamber. It was loaded. She had a box of cartridges. Jean-Pierre had left enough to make a stand. Outside, the sun was climbing higher in the sky. Dawn was long past, but the day of reckoning was far from over. It was only just beginning. The day bled away in a fever of anxious preparation. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the whisper of an approaching enemy. The air itself felt heavy, charged with unspoken violence. Isabel moved with a frantic, purposeful energy, her senses honed to a razor's edge. She brought in extra water from the creek and barred the shutters on the cabin's 2 small windows, plunging the interior into a gloomy twilight, lit only by the fire and a single lantern. The world outside was now reduced to thin slats of light and muffled sounds. Wombley, propped up against the wall, watched her every move. The fever still held him in its grip, but his eyes were clear and intelligent. He had torn a strip from his buckskin leggings and was methodically sharpening Isabel's small skinning knife on a whetstone from her hearth, the soft shk of the stone, a rhythmic, nerve-wracking counterpoint to the silence. Though he could barely stand, he was preparing to fight. His spirit refused to be broken. Samuel, bless his innocent heart, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation without needing words. He stayed close his small hand, often finding Isabel's, his presence, a constant, painful reminder of what was at stake. She had him fill every spare pouch and sack with cornmeal and dried meat. If they survived, they might have to run. "When they come, you go to the loft, and you do not come down," she told him, her voice low and serious. "No matter what, Samuel, you hide in the old chest and you stay silent. Promise me." He looked up at her, his bottom lip trembling slightly, but he nodded. "I promise, Mama." As the afternoon sun began to slant toward the west, Isabel took the rifle and climbed the ladder to the loft. There was a small, crudely cut opening under the eaves designed for ventilation. It offered a narrow but clear view of the valley approach from the east, the direction Wombley had indicated his people would come from. For hours she watched. The valley was deceptively peaceful. A hawk circled high overhead. A deer and its fawn drank from the creek. It was a scene of such tranquility, it made the violence she anticipated feel like a madness of the mind. Then she saw it. It wasn't a plume of dust or the sight of riders. It was a flicker of movement on a distant ridge, a momentary flash of reflected sunlight. A lookout. Minutes later, she saw another further south. They were communicating, coordinating. They were professionals moving with a disciplined stealth that was far more terrifying than a wild charge. They were closing the net. She scrambled down from the loft, her heart a frantic drum. "They're here," she said the words, barely a whisper. Wombley looked up from his sharpening, his face grim. He understood. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying, using the wall for support. He held the sharpened knife in his hand. He looked at Samuel, then at Isabel. He placed his free hand over his heart, then extended it to her. It was a gesture of respect, of gratitude. Thank you for the life you have given me. I will fight with you." Isabel's throat tightened. In the span of a single day, this stranger, this supposed enemy, had become a partner in her fate. The sun touched the horizon, setting the sky ablaze. It was a beautiful, terrible sunset, each fiery cloud a premonition. The Lakota would not attack in the unpredictable twilight. They were warriors of the sun. They would wait for the first light of dawn for the tactical advantage of clear sight. The night that followed was the longest of Isabel's life. Sleep was an impossible luxury. She and Wombly sat in the near darkness, the silence of the cabin, a taut string stretched to its breaking point. He would occasionally speak a soft Lakota word, and she would reply in English, the meaning lost, but the intent of shared vigil of mutual reassurance perfectly clear. She thought of Jean-Pierre, wishing desperately for his strength, his calm presence. But he was gone, and his strength would have to be her own. She loaded the Winchester and placed 3 extra cartridges on the table beside her. She had never fired it at a living thing, only at rabbits for the pot. The thought of aiming it at a man, any man, made her feel sick. But then she looked at Samuel, sleeping fitfully in the loft, and the sickness was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She was a mother, and a mother's love was a more formidable weapon than any rifle. As the first hint of pearlescent grey began to outline the edges of the shuttered windows, a new sound reached them. It was faint at first, a low vibration felt more than heard. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable sound of unshod ponies moving at a walk. They were not charging. They were surrounding the cabin, a silent, deadly tide. Wombly met her eyes across the dim room. He gave a single, solemn nod. The time for waiting was over. Isabel took her position at the front window, nudging the shutter open just a crack. Her hands were slick with sweat on the cold wood and steel of the rifle. She could see them now, maybe 20 riders materializing out of the morning mist like spirits. They were magnificent and terrifying, their faces painted for war, their bodies adorned with feathers and bone. They held lances and bows, and a few carried old trade rifles. One warrior, clearly the leader, sat on a powerful paint horse at the forefront. He was an older man, with a face like carved granite, a long war bonnet trailing down his back. This had to be their leader, Matto the Bear. The war chief raised his hand, and the riders stopped, forming a loose, inescapable semicircle around the cabin. He stared at the closed door, his expression unreadable. He was waiting. The storm had arrived. Isabel rested her cheek against the stock of the rifle, took a shaky breath, and prepared to face the thunder. The silence stretched thin and brittle. Outside, the world held its breath. Inside the cabin, Isabel could hear nothing but the frantic beating of her own heart and Samuel's soft, sleeping breaths from the loft. Wombly stood braced against the far wall knife, in hand, his posture a testament to sheer willpower over bodily weakness. The Lakota war chief Matto finally broke the stillness. He called out his voice, a deep baritone that rolled across the clearing. The words were in his own language, but the meaning was universal. A demand. A summons. Isabel knew this was the moment of truth. Hiding and waiting for a siege would end only one way. She had to show herself. She had to try to control the narrative, however impossible that seemed. "Stay here," she whispered to Wombly. "Don't let them see you yet." Taking a deep breath to steady her trembling hands, she leaned the Winchester just inside the doorframe where she could grab it in an instant. Then she lifted the heavy bar and pulled the door open. She stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the new morning light. She held her hands up, palms open and empty, a universal sign of peace. 20 pairs of hard obsidian eyes fixed on her. The collective animosity was a physical force pressing in on her. To them, she was the enemy, a white settler on their land, a face representing 1,000 broken treaties, and a tide of relentless invasion. Matto urged his horse a few steps forward. He spoke again, his tone sharp and questioning, gesturing toward the cabin. He was asking about Wombley. They had followed his trail here. They knew he was, or had been, inside. Isabel could only shake her head, her mind racing for a way to communicate. She pointed to herself. Isabel. Then she gestured to the cabin. Safe, she said, tapping her chest. Friend. The word was met with derisive snorts from some of the younger warriors. A friend. The notion was absurd to them. Matto's granite expression did not change. He was clearly unconvinced. He was about to speak again, likely to order his men to storm the cabin, when a new sound intruded. It was the one sound Isabel now feared almost as much as the Lakota war cries, the thud of shod horses approaching at a gallop from the west. A second dawn was breaking. Over the rise came Silas Blackwood Jedediah and 4 other hired men, all heavily armed. They reined in their horses, hard, creating a chaotic second front between Isabel and the Lakota. See! Blackwood yelled, his voice carrying in the tense air. He pointed a finger at Isabel. Just like I told you. The widow's in league with them. She's been harboring a killer. It was a brilliant, despicable move. He had seen the Lakota surrounding the cabin and had come not to rescue her, but to use the situation to his advantage. He would play the hero, the protector of civilization, wiping out the Indian threat and the traitorous widow in one clean, violent sweep. He would be lauded in Redemption Gap, and the Moreau homestead would be his. The Lakota warriors shifted their attention, now divided between the cabin and the new arrivals. Lances were lowered, bows were drawn taut. They were caught in a pincer. Matto looked from Blackwood's smug face to Isabel's terrified one, his eyes narrowed in confusion. At that moment, the cabin door creaked open further. Wombley emerged, staggering onto the porch to stand beside Isabel. He was pale and unsteady, but his eyes burned with a fierce light. He held the small skinning knife, a pitiful weapon against the arsenal, now aimed at them. The Lakota warriors let out a collective murmur. They saw their brother alive, but grievously wounded, standing next to the white woman, facing other white men. The picture did not make sense. Wombley ignored his own people. His gaze was locked on the men with Blackwood. His eyes scanned them, and then he saw him. Jedediah sitting on his horse, his new model repeater held at the ready. Wombley's fever-bright eyes widened in recognition. He took an unsteady step forward, raised a trembling arm, and pointed directly at Jedediah. He shouted a single guttural word, filled with accusation. Then he looked at Matto and pointed again at Jedediah, before clutching his own wounded side. The meaning was unmistakable, a story told in a single powerful gesture. He is the one who shot me. The truth slammed into Matto. This wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't a collaboration. It was something far more complicated. Blackwood saw his plan unraveling. The witness he'd left for dead was alive and pointing a finger at his foreman. Panic flickered in his eyes. "They're lying! It's a trick!" he screamed. "Fire kill them all!" Jedediah, his face, a mask of cold fury at being identified, needed no further encouragement. He raised his rifle, the one with the scratched stock, and took aim, not at the warriors but at Wombley. Isabel reacted on pure instinct. She dove back through the doorway, grabbed her Winchester, and came up firing. She didn't aim to kill, only to disrupt. The shot went wide, splintering the top rail of the small corral fence near Jedediah's horse. But her action was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The world erupted into a cacophony of gunfire war cries and screaming horses. Blackwood's men opened fire indiscriminately, their bullets thudding into the cabin walls and whistling past the ears of the Lakota. The Lakota masters of mounted combat scattered. They were not fools to charge into a prepared line of repeating rifles. They used their ponies' speed, circling and firing arrows with deadly accuracy. One of Blackwood's men screamed and fell from his saddle, an arrow sprouting from his throat. Isabel slammed the cabin door shut. "Samuel, stay down!" she yelled. A bullet punched through the wooden wall near her head, showering her with splinters. She crouched below the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was in a firefight. Her Isabel Moro, a widow and a mother, was in the middle of a war. Wambley had managed to drag himself back inside. He was leaning against the wall, his wound bleeding freely again, but his eyes were alive with the fire of battle. He pointed toward the back window. "Blackwood!" He grunted the one English word he seemed to know, likely learned from the confrontation the day before. Isabel understood. Blackwood and Jedediah weren't in the main fray. They were circling around, trying to get a clear shot through the rear of the cabin. She crept to the back window. Peeking through the crack, she saw them dismounted and using the cottonwood trees for cover. Jedediah was reloading while Blackwood was aiming carefully at the cabin, waiting for a target. He was going to kill them all. He was going to murder her and her son to cover his crimes. A wave of pure, cold rage washed over Isabel, extinguishing her fear. She rested the barrel of the Winchester on the windowsill, took a steadying breath just as Jean-Pierre had taught her, and lined up the sight on Silas Blackwood. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, its report shockingly loud inside the small cabin. Isabel didn't see if her shot landed. The immediate result was a spray of bark from the tree just beside Blackwood's head, close enough to make him cry out and stumble backward, his own shot going wild into the sky. But her action had exposed her position. Jedediah finished reloading, swung his rifle around, and unleashed a volley of shots toward her window. Wood splintered, and Isabel threw herself to the floor as bullets tore through the log wall where she had been seconds before. Outside, the battle had shifted. Matto, the Lakota war chief, was a brilliant tactician. Seeing Blackwood's men focused on the cabin, he led a daring, swift charge. His warriors swept in from the flank, their lances and arrows finding their marks. Two more of the hired guns went down in a flurry of arrows and desperate cries. The fight was turning into a rout. The remaining hired man lost his nerve, spurred his horse, and fled back the way he had come, a volley of arrows chasing him. Blackwood, his face pale with fury, and panic saw his small army collapsing. His plan was in ruins. He and Jedediah were now alone, caught between a fortified cabin and an enraged Lakota war band. "Back to the horses!" he screamed, firing one last panicked shot at the cabin before turning to run. Jedediah laid down covering fire, his repeating rifle spitting lead, forcing the warriors to take cover. It bought them the few precious seconds they needed. They scrambled onto their horses and galloped away, disappearing over the western ridge, leaving their dead and dying behind. Silence descended as sudden and jarring as the chaos that preceded it. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The morning sun illuminated a scene of carnage in Isabel's yard. Slowly, Isabel pushed the cabin door open. She stepped out, the Winchester held loosely at her side. The surviving Lakota warriors were regrouping, their faces grim. They were collecting their spent arrows and checking on their own, though it seemed none of them had been seriously injured. Matto dismounted and walked toward her. His expression was no longer hostile, but it was not friendly either. It was one of deep, weary contemplation. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze taking in the bullet-riddled cabin, the rifle in her hands, and finally Wambley, who had once again emerged to stand weakly at her side. Matto spoke, his voice low and measured. He looked at Wombley, then at Isabel. He gestured to the dead men in the yard, then to the direction Blackwood had fled. He was piecing the story together, a story of greed, attempted murder, and an unlikely alliance. Wombley responded in Lakota, his voice weak but firm. He spoke for a long time, recounting everything: the ambush, being shot by Jedediah, collapsing in the river, and Isabel pulling him out, tending his wound, and hiding him. He told of her defiance against Blackwood, and how she had fired the first shot in their defense. When he finished, an absolute silence fell over the valley. The warriors looked at Isabel with a new expression in their eyes. It was not friendship. It was not trust. It was something far rarer and more profound: respect. Matto stepped forward. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a single perfectly formed eagle feather, its tip dyed red. It was a symbol of honor, of a blood debt acknowledged. He held it out to her. "For the boy," he said the two English words, spoken with a thick, heavy accent. He had understood Samuel's name. He looked toward the cabin loft, acknowledging the child whose existence had undoubtedly played a role in Isabel's act of mercy. Isabel accepted the feather, her fingers closing around the delicate quill. It was a token, a promise. Not of peace between their peoples. The chasm was too wide, the wounds too deep for that. But it was a personal truce, a guarantee of safe passage. The people of Wombley and Matto would not trouble this cabin or its inhabitants. Two warriors helped Wombley onto a spare pony. Before he rode off, he met Isabel's eyes one last time. He raised his hand, palm forward, a gesture of farewell and deep, unspoken gratitude. Isabel nodded in return, a lump forming in her throat. She watched as they rode away, a silent, proud procession, disappearing back into the sacred hills, taking their wounded and their dead enemies with them, leaving the valley as quietly as they had arrived. Isabel stood alone on her porch, the eagle feather clutched in her hand, the smell of battle hanging in the air. Samuel came down from the loft and wrapped his arms around her legs, burying his face in her dress. She stroked his hair, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror. They were safe. The land was still hers, but the world was no longer the small, isolated place it had been yesterday. She had looked into the face of true savagery, and it wasn't the painted face of a Lakota warrior. It was the smiling, greedy face of a man like Silas Blackwood, and she had discovered a strength within herself she never knew she possessed. The sun was high in the sky now. An uneasy peace had settled over Whispering Creek. It was a peace paid for in blood and courage, as fragile as the feather she held. But it was hers, and for now that was enough. That single act of compassion, of pulling a stranger from a river, shattered Isabel Moreau's quiet life forever. She didn't just save a man. She unmasked a villain, stood against a tide of greed, and earned the respect of a people she had been taught to fear. Her story is a stark reminder that the lines we draw between friend and foe are often illusions, and the true courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. In the heart of the unforgiving West, a lone woman and her son survived not by building higher walls, but by opening their door. If her incredible story of bravery and the complex dance of survival moved you, please honor her memory by hitting that like button. Share this tale of the true West with others, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the forgotten heroes and unsung legends who shaped our history.